This video is part of the Infor OS 12 Features and Challenges series, and today we are going to compare new Infor developed authentication service provider called Infor OS STS with Microsoft authentication service provider called ADFS, as well as older Infor developed service provider LS STS. In the previous Infor OS video, as well as ADFS migration challenges videos, we discussed the differences between the service provider, SP, and the identity provider, IDP, and talked about SP and IDP components when ADFS and Infor STS is used. On this slide, you see general configuration of the services when a specific authentication method is employed. LS STS, an older method used by Infor until LSF ESP10, generally looks for users in the LDAP repository. That repository can be Active Directory, a third-party LDAP such as Tivoli Security Server, Oracle Identity Manager, and so on. It can also use users stored in Lawson internal repository located in the LSF primary LDAP server, such as ADLDS or STS. ADFS service provider assumes that your users are located in a repository accessible via SAML 2.0 protocol. Usually, it is the same or a different ADFS server, but can also be Ping Federate, Azure, Okta, and many other external identity providers. Infor STS service provider gives you a choice of a user repository accessible by LDAP bind, just like LS STS did, or a repository accessible via SAML 2.0 protocol like ADFS service provider does. You can even combine the two in case you have a mix of users in the Active Directory and non-Active Directory sources. So, here is an overview of the older LS STS authentication features. The main advantage of it is its simplicity. It's simple to set up and troubleshoot, and you can easily design your own programs and scripts that do behind the scenes authentication to do it. It also works well, albeit a bit slow at times, with all of the Infor software. It has its drawbacks, and the main one was its inability to incorporate advanced authentication features, such as a multi-factor authentication and multiple user repositories. So, Infor is decommissioning LS STS, which means at some point you will have to switch. The primary authentication method recommended by Infor until recently was ADFS. While it requires you to integrate your Infor installation with Active Directory, it's relatively easy to set up and maintain. It supports all software Infor released so far and can seamlessly integrate advanced authentication features such as multi-factor authentication. However, if you use ADFS as a service provider, Infor components need to take partial control over it, and that often does not sit well with the corporate Windows security folks, which are used to the software that simply uses ADFS as an identity provider. When switching to from LSSTS to ADFS, you may also find it necessary to use additional servers, since ADFS, for instance, cannot be co-located with the Infor OS aka Mingle 12 on the same box. You will also find the need to reconfigure your supplemental products, such as MSCM, LBI, and Smart Office, and have special procedures for users that use thick clients like a landmark-rich client. Infor STS, recently released by Infor, was designed to alleviate some of the drawbacks of ADFS as a service provider, while incorporating features that may make a switch from LS STS easier. First of all, it does not require all users to be in Active Directory or ADFS, though can use Active Directory repository as well, which will make it compelling for installations that have a mix of Active Directory and non-Active Directory users. It makes a process of connecting to external IDP much easier, which will make both Windows security folks and Lawson administrators happy. However, it is not compatible with Smart Office, which will deter quite a few clients in my opinion, and will require use of at least one non-standard SSL port, such as 9553, which is a port used by Infor STS service provider by default. Since LS's STS is being phased out, eventually you'll have to switch and use either ADFS or Infor STS as your authentication service provider. But will you go to Infor STS despite the fact that it just came out, or will you switch to ADFS despite the possible battle with your Microsoft Windows security folks? So, I came up with a few guidelines that may help you to make a proper selection. On this slide, you see reasons to use Infor STS as a service provider. If many or all of these items apply to your Lawson installation, Infor STS should be your choice. On the other hand, if you already implemented ADFS, Infor STS may not have enough compelling features to switch. Or perhaps you use SmartOffice, which will require you to stay with ADFS. There is also a possibility that you want to keep users and security information in sync between LSF and Landmark using ISS rather than BODs. All this would be proper reasons to keep ADFS. But let's say you implemented ADFS within 4 products already. Is there a compelling reason for you to migrate from ADFS service provider to Infor STS? I assume you do not have SmartOffice, otherwise you cannot switch to Infor STS anyway. I think the primary reason to consider switching is getting rid of ADFS service installation that is controlled by Infor. In every single ADFS implementation, we had a conversation with Windows security folks that really did not like the idea of having ADFS server that is governed by the rules other than the ones implemented for other ADFS instances on your network. ADFS essentially makes a security entry point. So in some way, the concerns are justified. So implementing Infor STS closes that potential security hole and keeps your Windows admins happy. The second compelling reason applies to companies that have users in multiple repositories, especially the ones that don't have all users defined in Active Directory. That may apply, for instance, to healthcare companies, where some of the doctors are not direct employees of the hospital, yet have business transactions that apply to them. Infor STS makes operations with multiple user repositories much easier, and also allows one to have users that are not part of any Active Directory. Finally, if you use external identity provider with Infor, such as Ping Federate or Azure, it will make their configuration with Infor much easier. In my experience, it's a pain to make ADFS service provider work correctly with them, and may require changes that depend on the version of the Ping Federate or Azure repository. Infor STS will make both initial configuration and ongoing maintenance of that connection much simpler. So, here I will provide you my biased opinion about it. I feel that Infor STS should be at least considered for all new installations, simply because it offers more features and choices unless you have a component that makes it difficult or impossible to use, such as in Lawson SmartOffice. You may also run into Infor licensing restrictions, so before implementing Infor STS, check with Infor whether you are licensed for STS as well. ADFS also makes it easier to stick to the default SSL ports, something that you may find difficult or impossible with Infor STS. Finally, while ADFS is supported by Microsoft, Infor STS is supported only by Infor, and your business or IT management may have a preference here. If you have a hard time choosing the right identity provider for your installation, Analyst can help, and here is our contact information. And this concludes this presentation. Thank you for watching this podcast. Please watch other podcasts in this series for more ADFS and Infor related information. This video podcast is brought to you by Analysts, bridging the gap between strategy and IT. Analysts is part of the ACS group. My name is Alex Zehansky.